Welcome to the Federal Mobility Policy Update for September 8th, 2020. This week, our guests are Darnell Grisby from the American Public Transportation Association and Beth Osborne from Transportation for America. As Congress comes back from the summer break, we'll look at how Washington is failing to address the transit emergency and how it's hurting Americans who do the essential work. Also, we'll look at public transit's role in fighting racism and the role of advocacy to prioritize transit. Welcome to another edition of the Federal Mobility Policy Podcast or broadcast. With us, we've got a great panelist to talk about what's been happening in the Beltway and around the nation. With us, we have our guests. We have Darnell Grisby, who is the Director of Policy Development and Research with the American Public Transportation Association. Welcome, Darnell. And we have our regular panelist, Beth Osborne, who's the Director of Transportation for America. Hi, Beth. And lastly, we have my co-host, Martha Rosowski, who's with Further Strategies. She's also the director of the Mobility and Access Funder Collaborative, who is sponsoring this broadcast. Welcome to all our hosts and our guests. We always start with a quick hits, so you know what's been happening. Congress has been on vacation. They're coming back. So let's start with our quick hits of what we should know for the week ahead. Let's start with Beth.
Well, the first thing to know is that there do not appear to be any active negotiations on a new COVID relief bill. The next opportunity for real action is a bill at the end of the fiscal year, which is September 30th, to keep the government operating. And it's possible they might add some additional actions to that. Particularly expected is extending the transportation program, which also expires that day. And now is really the time to build up the pressure to make sure Congress feels pressure to act and the White House feels pressure to act. So there's a lot of activities going on with some of our members and our colleagues at other organizations like Alliance for a Just Society and others to make sure Congress doesn't forget that this issue needs to be handled. Even if Congress doesn't act before September 30th, that pressure will translate until after the election when they come back and do something then.
Great. Darnell, what's your quick hits?
Quick hits would be, we are trying to bring people back to transit. And part of that is to show that we are safe and that we're ready to operate and have everyone travel in a safe fashion. The other is to make sure we build back service in an equitable way. So build back better, but build back equitably.
Great. So let's unpack some of that and go a little bit in greater depth. We know, Beth, that action in terms of reauthorization of the federal funding is not likely to happen. It's going to probably just kick it down the road, kick the can down the road. You said that audiences are starting to move forward, groups are starting to prioritize transit and prioritize the challenges and bring light to the challenges locally and then nationally. Talk a little bit more about how organizations are organizing themselves locally and nationally.
Well, you know, when COVID hit early in the year, a bunch of people jumped into action when we realized how transit was going to be affected. But, you know, it was an emergency response and everything kind of got thrown together to come up with the funding under the CARES Act, the $25 billion that has allowed transit to operate at a decent level since then. Now we've had a chance to start to form real coalitions and to plan and to be thoughtful, and we're turning all of that effort into action now. We hosted a town hall last month with transit agencies from across the country. We're working on putting something like that together with smaller agencies, a rural agency, a small town transit agency, to point out it's not just the big cities. We are working with Alliance for a Just Society and a network of transit advocates. We're going to have an op-ed campaign, letter writing campaign to Congress. We're talking about all kinds of different actions around these issues. We're talking with folks that are seeing cuts happen right now, like we just heard in Maryland. There's some evidence that back when the CARES Act funds were announced, Maryland said, great, we're going to cut our own funding. And then surprise, surprise, they now don't have any money left. So we want to spotlight that sort of thing and why it's important that the states also continue their support. So there's all kinds of things we can do. And it's essential that we do it now, because if a chance does open up, it's going to open up like that. And if it doesn't, they're going to remember who was rattling chains and causing trouble now when they come back to finish things up at the end of the year post-election.
Okay. And, you know, Darnell, I've been impressed in the way that APTA has played a leadership role in prioritizing transit and trying to bring to light the challenges that various agencies are having. I know ridership is down, financing is down. Talk a little bit about how that's affecting your members, and talk about how you're working with labor and other institutions to prioritize and bring light to the challenges that we're all facing.
Absolutely. So on the 15th of this month, we have a press conference, which will be pushing once again that public transportation is important and should be funded, that we're in dire straits right now, and the federal government needs to step up and actually invest in public transportation during this emergency period. We did some analysis earlier this year that showed that based on epidemiology models and economic models, we will have a hole of over $44 billion. So even though we're happy we received the $25 billion, there's still a hole of funding necessary that's been modeled out, and we can prove it. So beyond that, the question really becomes, what else do we need to prove? Right. We're serving essential workers during this time. We're working to make sure that our employees are safe. We're passing out masks to everyone. We're making sure that we have social distancing on buses and trains. Some people have added service back to make sure that there's proper social distancing on the buses and trains. So we're doing what it takes, but we also need to have our federal partners step up, and that is still not happening as of yet. So that's part of the challenge.
Great. Let's talk a little bit about the challenges on the ground. Let's talk a little bit about what does this mean to a person, particularly people of color who rely upon transit, not that they're the only ones. You wrote a good piece in CityFix a couple of weeks ago describing that challenge to people of color. Can you give me some more information so our funders can understand that transit is about equity?
Absolutely, and it's something that I've learned myself through my lived experience. You know, I grew up in a low-income household. We had generational poverty in our household, and a lot of it had to do with the fact that you could not get to work in the neighborhoods that we lived in. It would take hours to get to work, and oftentimes you have to get work that's closer to home that pays less. So working families around the country are really facing this even before the crisis hit. So to have service cut back further because there's not essential funding that's necessary is making those lives even more untenable. And it's really putting pressure on families that need to have the support of their government and the people of the United States of America during this trying time. Now, of course, this has an impact on our economy as well, because we know that late shift workers, for example, add billions of dollars to the economy. They needed support before this pandemic hit, and they need it even more so now. So really the question becomes, like I said before, what else do we need to prove to people who might have an ideology that's bent on something that is not facing reality?
Right.
The reality is there are needs in this country. We have gone through and done numerous research reports over the years that proved that it's a social equity piece, and as America gets more diverse over time, we're talking about more and more Americans that are part of this conversation that need to be listened to. And they're expressing their needs increasingly in this mobility justice moment that we're seeing around the country. So the question really becomes, how do we support those efforts? How do we build power in those communities to ensure that their voices can be heard even more so? Because right now, they're not being heard enough.
And I'd like to add to what he just said, you know, for those that might think, well, that's someone else's problem, it's not mine. You know, I think I've said it before in these briefings, but how great is it for you to be able to drive yourself to the hospital if the people you rely on to take care of you can't get there? You know, the notion that there are transit dependent people and it's not us was probably never true, but it's definitely an antiquated position today. You either want groceries on your shelves or you don't. You either want medical professionals there to take care of you or you don't. And if transit doesn't operate, they won't be there. And that makes us all transit dependent. I'll also point out that, you know, I grew up middle class and with plenty of opportunity, and I faced all the problems when I was first starting out, because it turns out when you graduate high school or college, you don't have money set aside to buy a car. You need a job to build up money to buy a car. And now some people might say, well, I'm just sitting on loads of cash to buy my kid a car, but most people aren't, and especially today they aren't. And we're going to see record numbers of car repossessions. So it really comes down to, if we want people to have a fair shot, whether they're low income or not, they have to have a way to get to work. And if we want our economy to restart, we have to make sure everyone who wants to work can get there.
Right.
And this whole notion of mobility justice is extraordinarily important, because really what we're talking about are interlocking systems of oppression that impact people who live in our communities. So for example, you might have a community that does not have enough public transportation service, but I can probably also guarantee you there's probably enough parks either or shaded walking paths. So you're talking about people who are getting hit not just in the pocketbook, but in their bodies as well, and increasing heat as climate change impacts our planet. So these are issues that are parts of interlocking oppression that we need to break down.
And the oppression that pre-existed COVID is now only getting worse and accelerating, right? And not just for people of color, but particularly people of color, but also anyone who needs to get to work or to get basic services who doesn't want to drive. Driving should not be the default. Martha, you've talked a little bit about the importance of both supporting transit justice, but also bringing a wider conversation with people so that we collectively are moving in support of transit. You want to expand a little bit about that?
Yeah. First, I want to do a really quick rant that I was going to ask our panelists about this, but I won't, because we probably don't have time. But the fact that Congress is not seriously considering action to deal with unemployment, with evictions, with the transit crisis and everything, I'm just going to go on record. I think that's a complete dereliction of duty. But I won't use our time for that rant, because I know we all agree. Okay, onward. You know, we're just wrapping up the first round of our matching fund, the mobility fund, and designed to support local advocates working on transit, working on biking and walking. And we got 26 applications from across the country, $1.2 million in requests. We were able to meet some of them, not all of them, really good requests. But one common theme through those, reading them, it's sort of like a meta-analysis of this, you know, a snapshot of what's going on with transit advocacy across the country, is that I think we are doing a better job of articulating how transit serves low-income communities, how it serves essential workers, how important it is, sort of making the equity case for transit, that I think we're getting better at that. I also think that the next step for us in terms of messaging is making the case that you guys were alluding to, that transit is essential for the functioning of cities. That if you're wealthy enough to have a car and you never need, you know, you never want to drive transit, transit still affects you, because we're going to be facing complete gridlock. If you're in the business community and, you know, transit isn't really your thing, guess what? Your workers need to get to, you know, need to get there. So it feels like in order to make this case across the aisle, across the demographics of power in our country, we have to make not only the equity case, but also the broader case of how essential transit is. So can you guys address that just for, you know, for a minute?
Absolutely.
Darnell, why don't you go first?
We at APTA have developed a series of reports over the last several years trying to make this economic case.
Yeah.
For example, let's just say you have a convention city and is competing for business with other convention cities. We found that you will get more business if you have a rail link to the airport. So that investment actually will yield more dollars for your hotel rooms, greater occupancy. It means you get additional tax revenue as well. And that's just looking at conventions. Now, if you look at, if you want to be a tech hub, this whole notion of what we call agglomeration economies, where as functions such as high-tech communities, they will attract additional functions to them because there's a whole ecosystem involved with that. And if you want to make sure that is protected so it can grow over time, transit, we proved in several communities, is the key. it actually is a linchpin to ensure further growth. And we proved this both in North Carolina with the Research Triangle. We proved it with Silicon Beach in Los Angeles. And there's other examples that we used around the country as well, that if you want to grow your tech sector, you need to have sustainable public transportation that's well funded and supported. Now, this is true outside of the tech sector as well, and I can get into that, but we've proved that you can get billions of dollars of additional tax revenue if you have investments in public transportation. So it's a net benefit to communities. And this is why it's important for the federal partner involved in this three-legged stool between local communities, the state, and the feds to actually play their proper role. Because if we want to get out of the economic doldrums that we currently are in, we need to have the proper level of investment in public transportation.
Yeah, and I will add, we have also done tons of research on this. You can just look at what happened with the fight over Amazon headquarters, HQ2. They put in their request for proposals specifically that there would be transit. They chose 2 areas that had super great transit service, and a whole bunch of cities recognized fully that their lack of transit took them out of competition. We did a report a few years ago called Core Values that looks at where businesses, 500 businesses across the country, where they had moved. They were all moving to city centers. We asked them why. They told us it was about walkability, transit service, those sorts of things. They were able to attract more talent. They were able to retain more talent. There's also a report that my colleagues at Smart Growth America and Locust developers do called Foot Traffic Ahead, which looks at areas that are walkable and transit served, and they have higher commercial value, they have higher property values. In fact, we know we have so undersupplied good transit while the demand is high, that's what causes the price pressures. So we're in this odd situation, like Yogi Berra saying no one ever goes there anymore because it's too popular, or whoever said that, or it's too crowded. It's the same thing with transit. It's like no one wants to live in those areas where there's transit because it's too expensive. I fear that there is a disconnect between basic 101 macroeconomics knowledge and what they believe. And I will just add, Martha, that you're right that this is a big issue in cities, but we constantly ignore small areas and rural areas. And there are, especially with the aging of those areas, transit dependence is high. 10 of the counties that have the most households with no cars are rural. This is a huge rural issue, and this is my lecture is shame on those who claim to represent rural areas that don't recognize the importance of transit. Rural transit is suffering big time because we underfunded on our best day, and they are really getting hit hard right now.
And one of the things I like to address real quick is people keep on saying right now during this COVID crisis that cities are going to become less important. But if we look at our history as human beings on this planet, that has never proven to be the case. And if it has been, it was only for a short period of time because there were policy problems that we had. And we need to address policy problems and not actually write off cities and transit because we're going to need them.
Yes. Yep. So let me switch gears a little bit. There's so much to talk about. So, no offense to your members, Darnell, but big transit agencies are not really known for being nimble and moving quickly. And yet it seems the virus, the financial challenges, the drops in ridership, the necessary service cuts are really pushing agencies to do things differently. I won't call it opportunity. I will say, imperative, necessity. And we are seeing some interesting things happen because of that pressure. And even some, perhaps some positive strategies emerging. Can you guys talk about those a little bit?
And Beth, I'll let you go first, because I know you have some ideas on that too.
Sure. I mean, it does often take emergencies to force us to look at things that we weren't really willing to look at before. It's not like these opportunities didn't exist, but sometimes we need a little kick. We've seen this in the slow streets movement too. A lot of that was not possible discuss until we needed to make space, particularly in lower income areas where they tend to have very little public space available to themselves outside of the roadway. Same thing is true in transit. And we're actually seeing transit agencies, I've spoken with a couple lately, that are trying to focus more on the non-work trip. Too much of our transportation system is focused on the commute. It is, before COVID, it was 20% of trips. During COVID, it's significantly less, and that has big implications that we can get into a different time. But it is a complicated issue to turn our whole transportation system and think about all of our trips. Now, since it's just such a, it's almost entirely what we do, it's become very important, and thinking about that is one thing they're doing. Thinking about whether or not there's more efficiencies to be gained by collapsing transit services, and instead of having maybe, you know, half a dozen or a dozen transit agencies in a metropolitan area, maybe we can have 3 or 4 agencies. Maybe we can, you know, really look regionally. You know, so I think that there's a lot going on that maybe we wouldn't have been able to talk about before, but we're forced to talk about now. Collaborations with, you know, companies like VIA and things like that too. You know, we'll try things out, we'll learn from them, and you know, it's important that we don't just suffer the consequences and the tragedies of COVID, but we actually use this to force conversations that we might not have been able to have otherwise.
And I would say it's really a success story in a way, because what you're looking at are agencies that have been underfunded for years, who have been overloaded with a lot of regulation over the years, having to actually be nimble given their environment and their politics. So this is an American success story in a lot of ways. So things like bus redesigns, where we're trying to find ways to cut costs in this difficult environment, but at the same time, we are actually finding ways to make the buses more efficient at the same time, but doing so in an equitable fashion, making sure that we serve underserved communities so that they're not once again left at the station.
When you're talking about bus redesigns, let's, for our audience, unpack what that means. That means redesigning the routes to having the bus go where people need to go from where they are, right? That's what you're talking about,
right.
Not about the physical design of the bus.
Well, that too, though.
Okay.
So there is talk about how do you redesign buses to make them more customer friendly, because as you know, the bus, and fundamentally in a lot of ways, has not changed customer facing in a lot of ways. The technology behind the bus has definitely changed, and they become much more difficult machines in order to do maintenance on, because you need to have people who are trained to be technicians now. In terms of the bus system redesigns, what we're looking at is sometimes because of politics and a variety of other things, you may not have had a system that had looked at its bus routes in some long period of time. And a lot of that is because of local politics. Now they're being forced to look at that more closely. And it was a trend that existed before COVID, but I think is actually getting even more entrenched now because of the fiscal difficulties. Also, there's this push towards how do we have contactless fare payment, because increasingly people don't want to touch anything. We already were on that track already anyway, but this just sort of makes it even more clear that the customer is demanding this, we should do this. Another thing that is definitely part of the conversation these days is crowdsourcing how many people on a bus or a train, so people know before they get to it how many people are on there, and that's the, you know, this use of new technologies, really. And also,
that's the signboards in advance, so when someone's waiting for a bus, it tells you how many slots are available. Is that?
That's actually on your phone.
Yeah. Oh, on your phone. Okay. Great.
So you actually know before you leave the house that the bus coming up might have some seats. So, you know, that's in partnership with a lot of private companies that have been working on this for years, such as Google. So, you know, those are a couple of examples. Beth mentioned some of the partnerships with companies like Lyft and Uber and Via. You know, that is something that has been ongoing. But once again, because of fiscal difficulties, you might find yourself having to replace bus service with what we call TNC, transportation network companies. That's a category that Uber and Lyft are actually in. You might partner with a TNC to actually serve certain former bus routes that were so-called low performing bus routes that were losing money. And you might ferry those folks to the main trunk line using that Lyft or Uber product or the Via product. So there's a lot of innovations happening. I think, what's the old phrase? I think it's, never leave a crisis unutilized.
Never let a crisis go to waste.
Yeah.
Right. And when you have situations where you're customer facing, there's a lot of politics, there's been underfunding for years, having a crisis like this brings the best out of you.
Your membership has some good examples of the redesign work. I know that, for example, Christoph Spieler, when he was in Houston leading that transit agency's board, helped with staff to redesign the Houston bus system. I know that that's happening in Boston, in Indianapolis. Local government and business interests passed a measure to fund bus rapid transit. So your membership is starting, they're pre-positioned with good examples, and now is the time to take advantage of those examples and replicate them in more places, it feels like.
There's one really radical thing that I love, which is this notion of if you need a bus lane, start putting out cones. This notion of tactical urbanism.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And working with the community to solve those problems, and using low-cost materials, and using these pilot programs to show stakeholders that historically may not be supportive of the bus lane, to show them over time, actually, your business actually increased because this bus lane that we have a pilot of is right in front of your dry cleaner. So those are some of the innovations that are happening, that we're doing it out of necessity.
I think that's a good model. The Summit Foundation funded People for Bikes and other institutions to look at the economic impacts of both BRT and bike lanes, and was able to show with good examples of where, in fact, revenues increased for those businesses along those routes. So yeah, there are a lot of good examples. How do we seize the time now? It feels like, Beth, you're in the process of working with both frontline communities and groups. Darnell, talk a little bit about the fund that you started. That's been intriguing, that your association is now funding advocacy in local organizations.
Exactly. So what we're really trying to fund are efforts to make sure that people on the ground in communities around the country can advocate for public transportation improvements in their community. We've had this program now for a while, but it's gotten very popular over the last couple of years. It's a relatively small program, but we received $360,000 in requests for what are actually small grant programs. These tend not to be more than a $10,000 grant. So to get $360,000 in actual requests says a lot about the popularity of the program, but it's really meant to help people do work on the ground that's going to deliver better public transportation service. And it can range from things like doing some of this tactical urbanism work to actually boots on the ground, knocking on doors to make sure that that transit ballot initiative actually passes to get more funding. So it's really meant to kind of buttress grassroots efforts on the streets in America for public transportation.
Great. And there's a similar matching fund that has been stood up by the Mobility and Access Funder Collaborative. Martha, we've just gotten through the first round of examining those proposals. You want to summarize what we've learned so far?
Yeah, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but I would say the three top hits is that, like many others in the nonprofit sector, the need is great right now. It's even, they're all working really hard to stay afloat and continue to do their good work. The second is that we have really good folks on the ground, smart, strategic folks who are doing the sort of the higher level policy, grass tops work, organizing, coalition building, doing the grassroots organizing, giving a voice to people who rely on transit, who are often not given a voice in the processes. And I would say the other encouraging thing is with these challenges around transit, we are seeing more and more funders step up into the space, whether it's new funders who supported those, provided local matches to request to the Mobility Fund, support for Beth and T4A for some of the field work that's going on. So, that's encouraging that the funding community has seen the need and are responding.
And can I add that the funding community that has stepped up has done it in a way that helped to create new partnerships
Yes.
with groups I might have liked to work with before, but just didn't have the operating funds to do the work, and now I do. And I think that this is going to create really great, important partnerships that will last for some time to come.
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
interesting work going on. I know, Beth, connecting what we think of on our side of the fence is sort of the mobility work, the biking, walking, transit, provide options so people don't have to drive, with the clean cars work, to clean up our vehicle fleet, address emissions, address greenhouse gases, pushing, it's neat that funders are stepping up from both sides, saying we need to work together. There's a lot of opportunities. So that's really, that's an encouraging thread in our world.
That's exciting. Yeah.
I think we need to wrap up, right?
We do. So we always wrap up with our pop question.
Yep.
Today's pop question is, in the world of transportation, who would you like to invite to dinner? It can be fictional or real. So who wants to start?
I have a name. It's not really in transportation, but
Okay.
I would like to think would be supportive. I'm a big fan of Ibram X. Kendi right now.
Yeah.
And I would love to have a conversation with him about mobility justice, transportation, and how it fits into anti-racism work, and get his perspectives on that as a professional in the field. That would be a great dinner or a great coffee or whatever it would be.
Hopefully we can get him on the show sometime soon and have you join us and we can have a conversation. Beth?
Well, so I actually had several thoughts go through my head, but the one.
It could be a dinner party. You could ask more than one. You could have more than
Well,
one.
I'm in a particularly spicy mood today, and so I'm inviting someone over to have a fight with out of the past, and that would be Robert Moses. And I'd really just like to walk him through all of the things he projected that were dead wrong, that blew up in everybody's faces, and was really designed for someone who used the city budget to have him driven around at basically a city funded limo.
Wow. Martha?
Well, I would go for, I think I need the dinner party, but I would go for Rosa Parks and John Lewis and, the others who are really involved in the transit strikes, really thinking about the role of transit in, breaking down some of the barriers in the South. Because I think that's a piece that a lot of us in the mobility world don't link into a lot of our work today, and connecting those dots. And, Martin Luther King, let's have this big dinner party and talk about transportation and opportunity and access and the work in the South. Seems really relevant today.
I would want to go to your dinner, so my choice is to go to your dinner and then bring along with me Jane Jacobs to see how that would interact. Ooh. That would be an interesting, someone should do a play on that, right? And then at the end, Moses can come and we can all just kind of harsh on Moses when he's ready. But let's not be harsh with our audience. Let's sign off for the day. Thank you for joining us. If you like this video, like it, share it with your friends. We'll be back soon with more information on the pending challenges on transit and other forms of mobility, including micromobility, biking, walking, and electric vehicles. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.